Hello and welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be going through 10 jazz albums that shook the world. Now that's not my title and it's not actually my 10 albums. I haven't chosen these. This list actually comes from the JAZZWISE magazine and website. And I came across it the other day and I thought actually it's a very, very good list of 10 essential jazz albums. It does have its limitations as a list, and I will get into this at the end of this video. But what I want to do is just go through each of these albums and just give you a little bit of background, some of my thoughts on it, whether this is even the greatest album by the artists that they put forward, because I think in many cases we could question this. But anyway, should we just head straight in and see where it leads us? So at number 10, JAZZWISE magazine has the Köln Concert by Keith Jarrett. Now, this album is a solo piano improvisation. Two improvisations, actually, the one that takes up one side and one that takes up the other. In 1975, Keith Jarrett sat down in Cologne on a subpar piano, which has now become legendary, which was a little bit out of tune at the extremes of the piano, so he had to improvise in the middle of the piano. He had an Eaton, and it didn't look like it was going to be a very positive experience. At the time, Keith Jarrett was signed to ECM Records under the production skills of Manfred Eicher. And Manfred Eicher has explored quite esoteric albums that featured just one instrument, often just improvising. Keith Jarrett was a master and is a master of this. And so this was an album, like many albums that Keith Jarrett made, a solo improvised piano album. Now, he wasn't the first to do this. Chick Corea had released two albums of improvisation in 1971 called Piano Improvisations Volume 1 and Volume 2, which was also on ECM Records. As I said, Keith Jarrett turned up to this performance. The piano was subpar, he had an Eaton, it was all a bit, the vibe wasn't quite right. And so Keith Jarrett sat down, improvised these two pieces. The album came out and it was called the Köln Concert. This album then went on to become one of the biggest selling albums in jazz history. Selling literally millions and millions of copies, and it has now become a legendary album. I can understand it being on this list, but in a way, it's a little bit of an outlier. This is perhaps the most recent album on the list. I'll just have a look. Yes, it definitely is. So on this list, they're trying to represent jazz from the 70s, perhaps, or jazz post-1970 with this album. And I don't know whether this album does that. I don't know whether it fulfills that. And even if we look at Keith Jarrett's incredible, vast discography, there's some incredible albums in there, absolute classics. But they're zoning in on this album because it sold millions and millions of copies. Now, Jarrett went on to make many, many albums in this vein. Once ECM Records had a hit record with this, because basically ECM is quite an esoteric jazz label that was pretty much propped up and established because of this album. The overheads on this album were negligible. I mean, basically it was a concert that Keith Jarrett was already doing, and they had put some microphones on the kit and they hit on the piano and they hit record. So it's, I don't know. And I have listened to this over and over again. And I'm a big fan of Keith Jarrett's piano solo improvisations. The album I grew up, it was called Concerts. Also, I had an album called The Moth and the Flame, which is a double album with another disc called Invocations. So those are the piano improvisation albums I grew up with. When I heard this album, what I was very aware of is that because Keith Jarrett was playing a subpar piano, because he couldn't go, all over the place, he makes it simple, basically. He keeps it pretty simple. He keeps it in the middle of the piano, and he plays this very sort of gospel-influenced, quite accessible improvisation, which is very relaxing. And I think it came out at just the right time. In 75, we'd had things like Tubular Bells and Jean-Michel Jarre, and the audience was there to buy this album that maybe they could put on the background when they're having dinner or when they want to sit and relax. And the whole sort of ambience of this album crossed over to the mainstream. It is a classic album. Sharrett, as always, plays brilliant on it. The improvisation is incredible for someone to be able to sit down and just make up music for like an hour, you know, out of nothing is quite incredible. I think it's on the list because of the sales. I think that's why this is here. And on this list, they don't apply that to the rest of the list. But I think because of its accessibility, if you were trying to put together 10 albums to start off a collection of jazz albums, you know, this would be a very good one to start with because it is very approachable. And it's approachable for an artist, Keith Jarrett, who can actually be pretty demanding as from a listener's point of view. Right, so that's what we've got at number 10. So we're up and going. Let's move now to number 9. At number 9, we have from Miles Davis, Bitches Brew. Now, Bitches Brew was the follow-up to an album he made in 1969 called In a Silent Way. And many people see this as being the beginning of jazz rock fusion. Miles Davis, of course, is a giant of 20th century music, emerging in the 1940s alongside Charlie Parker. He was part of the bebop movement. And then he came out with Birth of the Cool, which was another sort of sea change in jazz, which opened up the sort of whole West Coast jazz scene. In the 50s, he put one of the greatest jazz quartets together with John Coltrane and Cannonball Adderley and various pianists, Philly Joe Jones on drums. Made a whole series of incredible albums. He then teamed up with Gil Evans and reshaped the idea of the trumpet with a big band, almost like an orchestra. Incredible, incredible stuff. By the 1950s, he had his second great quintet, which featured Herbie Hancock, Ron Carter, Tony Williams, and Wayne Shorter. And this was a groundbreaking quintet. But as he moved through the 60s, because Miles had such open ears, he started to check out stuff that was happening in funk and soul and psychedelic rock music, even heavy metal. All sorts of different music went into his orbit. And somehow he channeled this out onto an album called In a Silent Way. Now, I don't believe that In a Silent Way really is the first jazz rock album. It's a sort of spacey jazz. It's very ambient, very droney. It is not the Mavish Orchestra or Return to Forever. But he followed that up in late 1969 with an album called Bitches Brew, where he put together a huge band that featured all these characters that would go on to become the superstars of jazz rock fusion, including Wayne Shorter, Joe Zawinul, Larry Young, Jack DeJohnette. Billy Cobham was at these sessions, although he doesn't appear on this album. John McLaughlin, Wayne Shorter, a whole host, you know, really incredible. There's almost like two bands there. This album's a difficult album. It's an out there album. It's basically music that no one had ever heard before. There's these funky grooves there, but there's also free jazz drumming happening at the same time. There's this huge writhing sound of all these musicians just improvising on the spot through compositions, not only by Miles Davis, but also by Joe Zawinul that had come in and was exploring the sorts of areas that would go on to create Weather Report. John McLaughlin's really featured on this album to such an extent that there's actually a track named after him. But again, this does not sound like jazz rock fusion. It sounds like some weird electric free voodoo jazz. It's one of my favorite albums of all time. But again, it doesn't even represent what Miles was going to do in the 70s as he brought this sound down to sort of psychedelic funk, which is incredible. Bitches Brew's a great album, but with these two albums, the Keith Jarrett Köln Concert and Bitches Brew, there is a nod to jazz rock. But I don't know whether these are the right albums to have. I actually think through the electric period of Miles, which starts with In a Silent Way and runs up through to Pangea and Agata in 1975, the album that I would say is seminal from that period, it's hard to say. In terms of laying the groundwork for jazz rock, it would be Jack Johnson, but I think that's an uneven album. the greatest bits on Jack Johnson is some of the greatest music ever recorded, but it does dawdle around at certain points, dare I say it. But that's the case. You know, if you buy that album, you might find that you listen to side one far more than side two, because side one was so much more groundbreaking. I always felt that the most coherent album from this period was Big Fun, which features outtakes from this Bitches Brew sessions. Of course, the best thing to get is the Bitches Brew box set, which has all this stuff on. But in terms of comparing these to the masterpieces that went before, things like Miles Smiles and Nefertiti, I don't see, and I love Bitches Brew. I am a massive fan of Bitches Brew. It changed my life. But stepping back objectively, it's a strange choice to be on here. Okay, now there's 2 Miles Davis albums on this list, which is strange because he's the only artist that hits twice, and both of them I'm not too sure about. So, but it would be an interesting album. Unlike the Köln concerts, it's not accessible. I have met so many people who have a problem with Bitches Brew. It's not easy listening music, but what has to be said is it did catch on with the sort of LSD dropping hippies that had got into the Grateful Dead around that time, and this did initially sell 500,000 copies. It's probably sold 1 million copies, and it was seen as a big commercial success, and it reinvented Miles Davis. To such an extent that Miles was accused of being a sellout when he brought this album, which I thought was ridiculous when you consider what the album actually sounds like, you know. So again, these first 2, I'm not too sure about. What I would swap Bitches Brew out with, I don't know. I think it would be a stretch to try and sell people Big Fun. I feel that In a Silent Way would be a better choice there, to be honest. And I'm a much bigger fan of Bitches Brew than I'm of In a Silent Way. But I think for somebody, that's the album that shook the world, really, is In a Silent Way. That was the groundbreaking album, one of the first electric jazz albums. Anyway, that's what we got at number 9. At number 8, we have the complete Savoy Masters by Charlie Parker. So Charlie Parker was recording in the 1940s. I believe this is the earliest album on this list, right? And I will come to this later because there's no Louis Armstrong, there's no Duke Ellington, there's no Count Basie, there's no Art Tatum, right? You know, and I can carry on. There's no Lester Young, there's no Coleman Hawkins. All these giants of jazz are not represented on this list. And actually, we're looking at a window which goes from about if you take out the Parker recording and you take out the Jarrett recordings, we're looking at a period that runs from about 15 years, over a 100-year history. As I'm doing this chat about this list, I looked at this and thought, this is a brilliant list. I've got loads to chat about there. But now I'm getting into it and talking about it, I'm starting to doubt it a little bit. Now, Charlie Parker emerged in the 1940s. He was the genius and the sound of bebop, and bebop was the big sea change in jazz that moved jazz from being a sort of popular music form to an esoteric music form. Charlie Parker was not allowed to do any recordings. The prime shakers and movers of that movement were actually experimenting with bebop, starting around about 1939 with the famous jams at Minton's. But because of a recording ban, they couldn't record till 1945. So what you get with the beboppers, especially Charlie Parker, is they suddenly go into the studio in 1945, and this style is it's done. It's refined. It's there. It's very hard to find the early bebop records that Charlie Parker or Dizzy Gillespie were doing. They're not there because the recordings never happened in that period over the war. They did not happen. They're not there. So suddenly in 45, these records come out, and they must have just blown people's mind. Now, Charlie Parker recorded on a number of different labels, Savoy being one, Dial being another. He also recorded for Verve, and I think he might have recorded for a label called Clef. That might have become Verve. The Verve albums were later, and this is where his biggest sellers reside, is in the albums he made with the string section. Now, these are looked down on a little bit by the jazz snobs, the snobby, snotty jazz snobs, because they're beautiful albums, and they're actually much easier to approach. And I wonder whether Going for Bird with Strings would have been the album to go for here, for someone approaching jazz. But the dial recordings, for me, are as equal in brilliance as the Savoy recordings. Remember, these are collections of basically 78 recordings. At this time, Charlie Parker was making just an A and a B side, and they were putting them out. These have been collected together. I believe this album, in this form, the one they're pointing at, which is called the Savoy Masters, because this has come out in a million different ways. This one came out in, I think, 1985. So this is some of the greatest jazz ever recorded. Charlie Parker's hit rate is astonishing, right? Charlie Parker is such an innate genius on the saxophone. Bebop is the sound of his view of music. And so even when he's at his worst, it's incredible. Even when he's out of his mind on alcohol or drugs, when he recorded Loverman, it's incredible. Now, what the Savoy recordings capture is what you get here is that actually those 1945 recordings when he first emerged. And so we get classic recordings like Donnelly and Coco, a whole bunch of absolutely incredible sides by Charlie Parker. We get him playing alongside Miles Davis and alongside Dizzy Gillespie. So you get to hear that as well, because Dizzy Gillespie is so important. Now, for me, this is about the best jazz has ever been. And so the argument for putting this at number 8 is a bit bonkers. I believe you could pick any Charlie Parker from any period and you could put it on this list. This is as good as it gets. I have no problem with this one. It's just too low on the list. That's what I feel with this one. Right, let's move on to number 7. At number 7, they have Charles Mingus with his album Ah Um, which came out in 1959. 1959 was like a watershed year for jazz. And the reason for that is because, as we said, in the 1940s, you had these 78 records, or 10-inch records. And then as the 1950s came in, the album started to, take hold. And this was really established by singers like Frank Sinatra that would literally create albums of music about the night, or albums of music for swinging lovers. They were themes. There was this is the beginning of the concept album, really. And the recording technology got better, the sound got better. And in 1959, you just get this watershed of classic albums. Usually focusing around Shape of Jazz to Come by Ornette Coleman, Kinda Blue by Miles Davis, Time Out by Dave Brubeck, and this album, Mingus Ah Um. Of those 4 albums, perhaps the least accessible is this album. But for Charlie Mingus, it's pretty accessible. Charlie Mingus had a vision. He was not just a virtuoso bass player, not just a bebop bass player. He was a composer and an orchestrator. He follows on from Duke Ellington in terms of his approach to music. He was very interested in collective improvisation. He was bordering towards free jazz before free jazz has happened. And he was also interested in exploring different avenues, different styles of music. So sometimes you get Mexican music, like say with Isabel's Table Dance, which is off my favourite album by Mingus, which is called Tijuana Moods. Now, my favourite album because it's the first one I got by him, and I thought it was wonderful. Mingus Ah Um is and it's a really brilliant album. Now, what never gets mentioned about this album is the fact that the title of it, Ah Um, it's not called Ah Um. It's called Mingus Ah Um, and this is a reference to Latin declensions. So I did a little bit of Latin when I was a kid, but I'm now going to try and record it and I'll get it wrong. But basically, in English, we would have I travel, you travel, she travels, they travel. That sort of declensions you get in language. And in Latin, it would be, if you were like a table, mensar, mensam, mentas, mentaris. I can't even remember anyway. And the Latin declensions usually go us, are, And so what this really should be titled, or it's pointed as, is Mingus, Mingar, Mingum. So what it's really saying is that this is Charlie Mingus for everybody. It's for you, it's for me, and it's for them. It's like looking it's opening out. And there's a concept behind this album because every single track is a tribute. It's either a tribute to Lester Young, who died that year, with the incredibly classic tune Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, that was later made famous by John McLaughlin and Jeff Beck on Wired. A beautiful tune. You've got Boogie Stop Shuffle, which starts off like a boogie, but is also a shuffle. So he's pointing back to the sort of the less esoteric music that he grew up with. And if there's one called Fables for Forbes, is that the one where he actually sings about this horrible racist governor in America? Every tune points at someone and it covers a lot of area. This is quite a conceptual album. Now, jazz albums aren't often like that. They don't often say something as pointed and political and referencing to the past and looking to the future. So it's a really great album. And things like Boogie Stop Shuffle, which is formed the basis for the Batman theme. So if you imagine the Batman theme, that's what that sounds like. There's a sort of coolness and almost like kitsch aspect to this album. Mingus is a real genius. I haven't explored him enough, and I need to. But I think this would be the album to go for. Yeah, I think having Mingus on the list is good, and I think having Mingus Ah Um is definitely a good choice. Let's move on to number 6 now, and we have Thelonious Monk's Different Corners. Now, I've been considering doing a whole video on Thelonious Monk. And I'll tell you why. Because there's aspects about Thelonious Monk that need to be discussed. Thelonious Monk, after Duke Ellington, is perhaps the greatest composer in jazz, second only to Duke. He's written more jazz standards than anybody. He plays a style of music that came out of bebop, but is not bebop. And it is so idiosyncratic and unique that we can all play in the style of Thelonious Monk. Thelonious Monk was actually older than Charlie Parker, 3 years older than Charlie Parker, born in 1917, and was a pioneer at those Minton sessions back in the late 30s. So he is one of the architects of bebop. And his approach to jazz is absolutely unique. He grew up listening to sort of the stride pianists like James P. Johnson, which I think lived close to Thelonious Monk. And he listened to people like U.B. Blake. And then he took a lot from Duke Ellington. And the genius thing he did is he took the language of bebop. He took the sort of harmonic sophistication, but he took none of the flow. People like Bud Powell and Charlie Parker would fly. I mean, Charlie Parker was called Charlie Bird Parker because when he played, it sounded like a bird. Thelonious Monk approached the piano more like a drum. And he created a whole language that is just his own. And because of this, even though he was older than Parker and he was recording right back in the 1940s, he never had any success whatsoever. And to such an extent that there was a lot of people in the jazz world that were supporting Thelonious Monk, and they would book him and put him on for a week somewhere, and literally nobody would turn up. Now, Different Corners, this album, which I think was recorded in 56, 57, this was his breakthrough album. He'd been around for 15 years, right? And within that 15 years, at one point, he got busted by the police, sat in a car with Bud Powell, and Bud Powell's drugs, I think he had a bit of marijuana in that car, and it got discovered, and Thelonious Monk, being Thelonious Monk, he took the blame, right? So he then had his performance card banned, and he couldn't perform. This guy had a whole bunch of bad luck until this album came out. This is important because it establishes Thelonious Monk. Now, is it his greatest album? Well, my favourite album by Thelonious Monk is the album he made with John Coltrane. It's the solo piano album he made in the 60s, absolutely incredible. The classic quartet with Charlie Rouse and all those guys on, Wilbur Ware, Shadow Wilson. That is not this, and they made some incredible albums. But this is a really brilliant album. It features Sonny Rollins on saxophone, which is an essential jazz musician to listen to. And the title track, Different Corners, was so hard to play. Monk's stuff seems abstract and strange and a little bit twee, but it's actually immensely complex. And this opening track had so many tempo changes and irregular bar lengths and strange harmonies and key changes that these virtuoso musicians couldn't play it. And in the studio, they would do take after take after take trying to get it. And I think Alfred Line, who recorded it, eventually had to edit this together. It is a work of genius. At one point, I think Thelonious Monk appears playing a Celeste, and he still sounds like Thelonious Monk. It's incredible. Now, Thelonious Monk, all the weirdness and strangeness seems to come out of his personality, which was, we could say, eccentric to say the least. Unlike many jazz musicians, when he wasn't soloing on a concert, he would get up and start dancing around the stage, and we could call it dancing, and it's more like trancing. He seems to be in a trance, wearing some strange hats, and doing all the incredible guy. By the 1970s, I think whatever mental health issues, he was suffering with were getting worse and they were being exacerbated. And I don't think this has been really discussed that much. His last tour he did was in 1971, and he died, I think, of a stroke in 1982. Now, when he did that final tour, he spoke to no one on that tour. The drummer was Art Blake. He can't remember the bass player. But afterwards, when somebody said to him, "Why didn't you speak?" He said, "I didn't want to say anything because Art Blakey and the bass player were too ugly." Which I think is just very, it's so Thelonious Monk. And then after that, he sort of goes into basically seclusion. And he spent his last days in one room, not playing the piano, until he died in his early 60s. And so there's a story there that echoes through the music for me. Thelonious Monk put himself and his personality so deeply into the music. And I think there was a window, starting with this album and running up probably to about 1965, when it was absolute genius. One of the things that people said who worked with Thelonious Monk said he was like a teacher. If you go and Google it, he came up with a list of 25 sort of hints and advice for musicians. It's wonderful. And he had a lot of time to sit down and talk and explain what his concept was about. And that seemed to wane away as time went on. So in this career that sort of lasted from the late 30s to the early 70s, which was quite a trawl, this is the defining album of Thelonious Monk. This is where he got it right. This is where he's really put his compositions forward. Now, the only thing about this album, it doesn't feature Round Midnight. It doesn't feature any of these sort of, rhythming, all these classic Thelonious Monk tunes. They're not on there so much. For that, you would want to go for the genius of Thelonious Monk, which is a 1940s album, which is another album I really love. But it's not as accessible. Again, this is possibly the most accessible of the Thelonious Monk albums. I think this is a reasonable choice. It's a good one to put on. At number 5, we have Saxophone Colossus by Sonny Rollins. Sonny Rollins is still with us. He was born in 1930, so he's now 94 years old. He can't play anymore, but he's one of the few people still alive. Recently, we lost Lou Donaldson. And we lost Roy Haynes, so he's last man standing of anybody who played alongside Charlie Parker and came out of that bebop period. But Sonny Rollins is a giant of improvised music. He's one of the greatest improvisers in jazz, I would say, in the last 70 years. All right? And so I feel if you really want to understand what a musician can do with improvisation on a saxophone, Sonny Rollins is the guy. You need a Sonny Rollins album. Now, this album, for some reason, has become the famous album, Saxophone Colossus. I've listened to quite a few albums through the 1950s. They are all as great as each other. I really like Way Out West. But at the end of the 50s, Sonny Rollins retreated back into himself and he started practicing and working on his approach. And famously, he used to go to a bridge, some bridge in New York, I think, and he would stand on the bridge and play his saxophone in the wind, searching for this sound. It's that very romantic idea of the jazz musician. And after that, he came out and he made an album called The Bridge with Jim Hall. That, for me, is his greatest album. It's incredible. And some of the things he does improvisationally on that album are incredible. This one has, I've forgotten the name of the track. Which is called Can't remember the title of it. Sorry. And it's a sort of calypso. And that was quite accessible. Again, you could see why they're going for this, you know, but the rest of the albums is brilliant. Yeah, it's as good as any album to represent Sonny Rollins. I would have gone for The Bridge. Okay. At number 4, we have Sunday at the Village Vanguard by Bill Evans. Bill Evans is a giant within jazz. And I believe that so much that happened in jazz after Bill Evans was working late 50s, early 60s, running right up to 1980 when he died, relatively young, I think it was about 52, laid the groundwork for so many disparate musicians. I think that Keith Jarrett has a whole ton of Bill Evans' approach. Chick Corea does, John McLaughlin does, Alan Holdsworth does, Lenny Brew does. There's an approach to harmony and an approach to soloing as well. There's a fluidity to Bill Evans' playing. He was classically trained and he was a virtuoso musician. He could really play, and yet he does not blow you away with his chops. When you listen to some of the early albums, he's doing some incredibly virtuoso stuff. But he is approaching jazz almost like a sort of French romantic composer. There's that harmonic beauty in there. And he wants to blur the harmony. Jazz is very much about the chord changes. It's very much about the 2-5-1 and building everything up from below. Now, Bill Evans works entirely within that realm, but he is pushing it so it becomes unfocused, impressionistic. It's an incredible thing. It's not as way out as the free jazz musicians. It's not as way out as Ornette Coleman or, you know, all these players. And it's easy to put Bill Evans in the category of being, I don't know, sort of cocktail piano, and it's just not at all. This unfettered impressionistic approach was sent into space when he teamed up with Scott LaFaro in the early 60s. Scott LaFaro had really reimagined the bass, and he uncouples jazz. He's no longer playing root notes. He's no longer playing walking lines. He's improvising almost as a counterpoint to the piano. And this totally renegotiates the jazz piano trio. And it has never ever been surpassed, in my opinion, as on this album, Sunday at the Village Vanguard. In 1961, I think in September, Bill Evans turned up to the Village Vanguard and they recorded 4 shows, and these got edited into 2 albums. One was called Waltz for Debbie and one was called Sunday at the Village Vanguard. Within 2 weeks, the great Scott LaFaro, who was only 24 years old and could completely, change the face of bass playing, died in a car crash. This knocked Bill Evans about a lot because this sound had been suddenly discovered. The record label, knowing that Scott LaFaro died, rushed to release this album where it features all the sort of flying, incredible playing of Scott LaFaro. But when you sit down and listen to it, what you actually hear is the piano and the bass interacting together. It's absolutely unique. And Paul Motion, my God, what a drummer. As I get older, Paul Motion's playing is incredible. His brushwork's immaculate. He can swing. And again, he should be holding it down. He should be keeping the timekeepers roll while the bass and the piano go off, but he doesn't. So this is the greatest jazz piano trio album of all time. It definitely belongs on this list. I think it's one of the greatest jazz albums ever made. So that's what we got at number 3. At number 2, we have Shape of Jazz to Come by Ornette Coleman. This is the great groundbreaking album. You know, jazz after bebop was in the shadow of bebop. You know, West Coast jazz, hard bop, all these things are in the shadow of bebop. The jazz musicians were trying to escape. They were looking at modality. They were looking at trying to bust the 2-5-1, the basic chord progression open. They were trying to get past that. And nobody knew how to do it. And then Ornette Coleman comes along with almost like childlike naivety. And he just goes, well, we just ignore them. What we do is we focus on the music as a whole. And we let the music evolve however we want it to evolve. This shocks everybody. It divides jazz down the middle. Certain musicians like Miles Davis think it's just awful. You know, it doesn't mean anything. And then musicians like John Lewis and the Modern Jazz Quartet, quite a traditional player at that time, really championed Ornette. He did a week in the 5 spots in 1959, and all them in Leonard Bernstein. They're all turning up to see what is Ornette doing. Now, Ornette's music can be difficult. If you want to go and check out the album Free Jazz, you'll see what I mean. But this album has his incredible compositions on. And something like Lonely Woman, I think, for all the free jazz thing going on, for all the not following the chord change and all that thing that's going on, this incredible quartet he's got, you know, with Charlie Hayden and, you know, Don Cherry on pocket trumpet, and the whole, as groundbreaking it is, this is an incredibly beautiful album. Now, Ornette Coleman, as he goes into the future, he gets even more playful and childlike, and the tune's incredibly complex, but they're also like nursery rhymes. This album's not like that. And it's the best place to start if you want to understand free jazz. And I think this and what they've got at number 2 represent what was happening in the 60s brilliantly. Because at number 2, we have A Love Supreme by John Coltrane. One of the greatest albums ever made by anybody. And it's one of Coltrane's greatest albums. It's a 4-part hymn, prayer to God. It brings in the idea of spirituality to music. It brings in the idea of modality. Elvin Jones' approach to drums is just a game changer as he brings in all these polyrhythms, opening up the rhythm. He starts to create rhythmical cadences that are equal to the cadences. So you don't need the cadence in jazz anymore because the cadence is coming from somewhere else. It uses modalities, uses free improvisation. Jimmy Garrison is strumming the bass like a flamenco guitarist, and McCoy Tyner is offering a harmonic approach to jazz using chordal harmony, which is a lot more three-dimensional. Chordal harmony suggests all the keys, you know, it suggests a cycle of force. Everything is out. This is one of the greatest albums ever made. The only thing for me is Coltrane was such a virtuoso and such a high-powered player. He brought so much energy into the music. And when you go and check out something like Chasing the Train, or some of the tracks on Live at Birdland, especially the cadenza on I Want to Talk About You, you hear an aspect of Coltrane which isn't covered so much on this album. So you can buy this album, but you will not get the full picture of Coltrane. But perhaps he's such a giant of music that you just can't, not with one album. Although I would suggest Live at Birdland would be the one. He plays soprano on it, tenor sax, there's a drum and bass duet, there's a track called Alabama, which explores the sound of A Love Supreme. But this is a beautiful album. It's one of the greatest albums ever made, and should be at the top of this list. And it's not, because at number 1 we have, of course, Kind of Blue, the biggest selling jazz album in history. Again, Miles Davis, recorded in 1959. And again, not representative of Miles Davis. Miles had one of the hottest, fieriest groups in the 1950s. If you go and check out Milestones, it blows your head off. And you've got John Coltrane and Cannonball Adderley, Philly Joe Jones all over the place. Absolutely incredible. The difference with this album is this is really a collaboration between Miles and Bill Evans. Now, what Bill Evans does on Sunday at the Village Vanguard, for me, is even beyond what Kind of Blue does. Kind of Blue is a very, very accessible album. It's very relaxing and beautiful. It's beautifully recorded. It's the biggest selling album in history, and that is why they've put it at number 1. But for me, I would put Love Supreme at number 1, but it doesn't really matter. We've got these 10 albums here, haven't we? So we've gone through this list. As you can see, I've had issues, but I do think this is a really great list. And I think if you were to buy these 10 albums, you would have the beginnings of a brilliant jazz collection. The problem with this list is the overriding giants of jazz was Louis Armstrong, Jelly Roll Morton, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Art Tatum, Lester Young, Coleman Hawkins. And then you have the sort of accessible jazz, the jazz that made jazz that made us still talking about it now. Is this people like Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw, and the swing jazz that represents, you know, America at that time. And none of that's there. To not have Duke Ellington on this list, to not have Louis Armstrong on this list, and perhaps not to have Coleman Hawkins' incredible recordings he made in the 1930s, where he really took saxophone, body and soul, and then later Picasso. These are really classic recordings to me. And then also at the other end, everything that's happened after 1970 is represented. I would want to put onto this perhaps the In a Mountain Flay by the Mavish Orchestra. I think that would be a better choice for me than maybe even Bitch's Brew. In terms of Keith Jarrett, I actually think a solo piano album would be a good choice to have on, but I would go for concerts. So it's okay. The big problem for me is it's just missing out chunks of jazz. And it's honing in on a period that is around about 1959. This is this classic period of jazz, which everybody sees as being jazz. And it's worth thinking why that is, why those albums are not, say, Meditations by John Coltrane and, you know, not Heavy Weather by Weather Report, all these other albums that sold millions of copies. Why they're not seen as jazz, are they? There's too much, after 1959, there's too much of a development away from jazz. And when you go pre-bebop, it's too far away for most contemporary ears to deal with. So we end up with this sort of Goldilocks period around about 1959. But yeah, it's a very good list. I will have a link to the list in the description down below. Go and check it out. Go and check these albums out if you haven't heard of them. Everyone is a masterpiece on this list, without a doubt. There's no bad albums, or why have they got this? So yeah, that is my 10 jazz albums that shook the world. The question is, did they? Kind of Blue? Yep. Beginning of modal jazz, in a way, although other people were doing it. A Love Supreme, without doubt, brought spirituality into jazz, laid the groundwork for the improvisational approaches that were going to go on into jazz fusion. Shape of Jazz to Come, beginning of free jazz, without a doubt. Sunday at the Village, Vanguard, Bill Evans renegotiates the jazz piano trio and the harmonic approach and improvisational approaches in jazz. Sonny Rollins' Saxophone Colossus, I don't think that one is so much. I don't think Sonny Rollins I don't see Sonny Rollins as a groundbreaking musician as I do Miles Davis or Thelonious Monk. It's a discussion for another video, perhaps. Different corners, yeah, I think so. That's when Thelonious Monk emerges and changed the world. Mingus Ah Um, I would say, yeah, very successful album. Of course, Charlie Parker, yep. Bitch's Brew, yep. Keith Jarrett, Köln Concert, not really. Just sold a lot of records. You could have had Heavy Weather by Weather Report there. So there's a couple, I would say the Sonny Rollins and the Keith Jarrett we could take out. But the rest of the list stands. I would put The Bridge in by Sonny Rollins. But really, I would be putting a Louis Armstrong in. I would put the Hot Fives in and scrap that one, because we get Sonny Rollins playing on different corners and he's actually more interesting on that album. And I think I would take the Jarrett out and put Duke Ellington in. Now, which one would you put? Probably a box set of all the sort of classic 1930s recordings with Caravan and Mood Indigo on. That is what I would do. So, another list of jazz albums for you. Not mine, but you've had my opinion about it, and I hope I've imparted some interesting information for you. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please put a like on it. If you want to see some more, please subscribe. If you like this moody dark look that I've gone for, then, you know, say we love the moody dark look. It means I've got to come down the studio at night time and I get scared because it's full of ghosts and creepy things going on. But there's an ambience here. It's more jazz. That's what I thought. If you want to support me, you can become a Patreon. and the link to that is down below. You can become a free member or a paid member. There's content for both. There's a ton of content for both. So I would suggest just go and become a free member, see how it goes. If you want to give me a financial tip, there's a link to my PayPal tip jar, and I appreciate that very much. And also, there is a link to the Jellyman's Heritage Arts Charity, which is the organisation that support me in my home here and allow me to make these videos and have a lovely time talking about jazz and doing all that. I hope you enjoyed this video. I will see you on the next. Peace and love, and keep the jazz alive. Thanks for watching.